So we're finally starting our unit on cells, and it only feels right to start it off with a discussion of what are cells, what are the different types of cells. But first, let's go back to when we discussed the organization of living things. So in our ecology unit, we discussed all this level here: biosphere, ecosystem, community, etc. And then we jumped back down last unit to this area, the chemistry area. What's an atom, a molecule? What are our macromolecules? These are things like your carbs, your lipids, your proteins, and your nucleic acids. And now we're going to be looking at this area here, mostly these two, organelles and cells, with a brief discussion about tissues. So what are cells? Cells are the basic building block of all life. They make up all living things. They represent the smallest that life can be. So you normally look around and you think of living things, oh, that's like a person or an animal or a plant. But you forget that something as tiny as a little bacteria or an amoeba, a single cell, is still life. It's its own organism all on its own. So we call these differences unicellular and multicellular. A unicellular species is a single or one-celled species like bacteria. A multicellular species or organism is an organism where it's made up of many cells like us, like plants. And you can see in this image here, these are just some of the tissues that make up the human or the animal body. You can see blood here, you can see bone here. A lot of this is what we call connective tissue. Then up in the top here you have an amoeba. This is one single cell. It may have a funky shape, but it's just one cell. So this is unicellular, and these would be the parts of a multicellular organism, the tissues that are making up the multicellular organism. And you can see all the different cells within these tissues. So we can break down all types of cells into two groups: prokaryotes and eukaryotes. And the basics is a prokaryote is a cell that does not have a nucleus or membrane-bound organelles. We're going to talk a little bit more about what that means in a later slide. Things like bacteria. If you want to break down the word, pro means before, and karyon, it's a Greek word meaning kernel, which essentially we take to mean the nucleus. So these are before the nucleus cells, like simplistic cells, one might say, even though they're very far from being simple. Eukaryotes, on the other hand, have the prefix EU. It means true. So these are true nucleus cells. They have a nucleus to hold their DNA, and they have membrane-bound organelles. And like I said, I'll discuss more what that means later. So these are the cells that you're most familiar with, things that make up plants and animals. You are a eukaryote. That's the way I like to remember that. Now, what are the main similarities and differences between these two cells? Well, to start off, all cells, whether prokaryotic or eukaryotic, have to have at least these four main cell parts: a cell membrane to enclose your cell. It's kind of like if you're thinking about a water balloon, the membrane would be the balloon itself, and then the cytoplasm would be the water that fills it up. So cytoplasm is a jelly water-like fluid that fills up the inside of the cell. This is where all of the chemical reactions will occur. You also have little ribosomes. These are where we make proteins. And then you'll have DNA and RNA, either in a nucleus if it's a eukaryotic cell, or in an area called the nucleoid region if it's a prokaryote. So going into specifics a little bit more here. Prokaryotes, like I said, are considered to be more simplistic. Now, in real life, they are very complex. There's a whole type of biology devoted to learning about them called microbiology. But for our terms and for basic understandings, yes, they do seem much more simplistic than eukaryotic cells. They are definitely much, much smaller. So they're tiny compared to our cells. Now, they do not have a nucleus, so what that means is they don't have a special membrane or sac to hold their DNA and protect it. So it's kind of all jumbled up in the middle of the cell or off to the side of the cell in what we call a nucleoid. Now, like I said, they all have ribosomes. All cells have ribosomes, so you can see that there's ribosomes inside this cell as well. We can see that there's a green cell membrane here. And what prokaryotes have is a special type of cell wall. Every single prokaryote has a cell wall. Some eukaryotes do, but not all. We don't have cell walls. Animal cells don't. Another interesting thing about prokaryotes is that they're all unicellular species. They don't grow into multicellular organisms like plants and animals. Now, some extra little things that you may see inside a prokaryotic cell. You may see these plasmids. They're tiny little pieces of circular DNA that have been separated or that they got from other areas or from other cells even. And this just will help them become more adaptable to their environment. You may see them with these little tails that we call flagella. That's how they move. You may even see these little hairs called pili on them. Those help the bacteria stick to each other and to other surfaces. Sometimes you'll even see what we call a capsule. It's a carbohydrate that covers the entire outside of the cell. And think of sugar, it's pretty sticky. All carbohydrates are actually pretty sticky. So this actually makes them able to stick to surfaces or stick to places inside your body if they want to get in and they end up causing diseases. Now eukaryotes, like I said, are considered more complex because they have a lot more parts that seem to be more advanced than the prokaryotes. They can be unicellular or multicellular, like our bodies, or like a little amoeba. They are also much, much larger than prokaryotes. So these are big cells, and prokaryotes tend to be smaller cells. Now, the main thing between the prokaryote and the eukaryote, remember, is the nucleus. So eukaryotes have a nucleus. It's like a sac that holds the DNA and protects it. They also have what we call membrane-bound organelles. So just like there's a membrane or a sac around the nucleus and around the cell itself, we also see other organelles that have these membrane structures around them, that have membranes. All of these organelles that you see are made up of the same membrane material. Things like the mitochondria and the chloroplasts, you may have heard of those before. Now, all of these structures you don't find in prokaryotic cells. These are more advanced structures. Now, you'll also find all the parts that we find in a normal cell, the cytoplasm, the cell membrane, DNA, and ribosomes. You have to have all those four. Now, later we'll talk about the difference between different types of eukaryotic cells, because there's plant and animal cells, but we'll get into that another time. Now, people like to organize things and classify things. So we like to put life in these little classifications and say, well, you're like this type of life and you're like this type of life. So we have things like mammals, we have birds, we have reptiles. We classify life into these different groups of who are you similar to. So we can do this with cells as well. The broadest type of classification. What I mean by that is the classification that holds the most amount of different kinds of species is domain. So the domains are the top of the classification, and you get more and more specific as you go down until you get to a species. That's the most specific. and we'll talk about that more later in the year. So all life is found into three domains: eukarya, bacteria, and archaea. So let's go into these one at a time. So eukarya, this is the domain that includes all eukaryotic cells, all eukaryotic organisms. So things like amoebas, or humans, or plants, or animals, or mushrooms, all of these fall under this domain. Bacteria is what you would normally consider a prokaryote. This is the stereotypical prokaryote cell that you think of. And this particular domain, their cell wall, because remember all prokaryotes have a cell wall, is made of something called peptidoglycan. And that's what's going to really make it a little bit different than archaea here that we'll talk about next. And bacteria, this domain is very hardy. They can survive almost everywhere around the world. And this particular domain is very different from the other two. Even though bacteria and archaea are both prokaryotic, there's special things about archaea that make them very similar to eukaryotes compared to bacteria. So actually, eukaryotes and archaea are a little closer together, and bacteria is much more separate than these other two. So this domain includes things that we would normally consider bacteria, the things you find on your body, in the soil, the things that make you sick. Then there's archaea. This is our second prokaryotic domain. So there's two prokaryote domains, archaea and bacteria, and there's one eukaryotic domain, eukarya. So these, like I said, are a little more similar to the eukaryotes in very specific ways that we don't need to get into in this class, but they're still prokaryotes. So they still have no nucleus, and they have cell walls as well, but they're often made of something very different than peptidoglycan. And these are found all over the world in places that we would consider to be very extreme or hostile to life, like deep sea ocean vents. There's so much pressure and so much heat there and very little what we would consider food, and yet these things survive and thrive and they grow very easily there. Something like the hot springs in Yellowstone National Park, or the Great Salt Lake or the Dead Sea, these guys like very salty, very hot, very extreme conditions. All right, so that is an intro to cells. Remember, cells are the basic building block of life. They can be unicellular, single-celled, or multicellular, many-celled. And they can be broken down into two types, prokaryotes and eukaryotes. The prokaryotes are small. They're also considered more simple cells. They do not have a nucleus and they do not have membrane-bound organelles. Eukaryotes, on the other hand, are larger, more complex. They have a nucleus and they have membrane-bound organelles. And all cells have to have at least 4 parts: a membrane, cytoplasm, ribosomes, and a nucleic acid like DNA. And we classify all living things based on their cell type into 3 domains: eukarya for all the eukaryotic organisms, and bacteria and archaea for all the prokaryotic organisms, with the archaea being a little more extremophiles. They like to live in extreme conditions.